first up, the USFL dropped their rules last week as players started coming into camp. And we had our own Andrew Murray, taking a look at the differences between the USFL Rulebook and the XFL Rulebook. And the thing is that there is a lot of similarities. Now, when Brian Woods talked about that their USFL would be about 98% identical to the NFL Rulebook, we did get some glances of some things that may not be a carbon copy of the NFL, but actually XFL 2020 Rulebook stuff, part of the 2.0 era, which was developed by its creator, Sam Schwartzstein. If imitation is indeed sincerest form of flattery, then the USFL is handing Schwartzstein their biggest compliment. So here we go. The XFL was able to separate itself from other leagues, emphasizing innovation in play mechanics, officiating, technology, player safety. The USFL seeks to combine the best of what they worked for their predecessors and combine those elements into one cohesive model of pigskin legislation. The time has come to compare the USFL rulebook to the XFL and others. So one of the consistent themes in the XFL was the de-emphasis on kicking as a critical function during plays. The extra point system was emblematic of this, as teams were no longer permitted to kick extra points. Instead, and if you remember this, definitely the Houston Roughnecks used to do this a lot, upon a scoring touchdown, squads could elect to either go for a 1-point, 2-point, or from the 5-yard line, or a 3-point conversion from the 10-yard line. A lot of teams were doing the 2-point. Then they started realizing that maybe they should just go for 3 on the 10-yard line, give them a little bit more space. This allowed teams to not have more scoring options, but also the teams potentially tie a game if they were down by 9 points. The USFL has adopted this format in a similar manner, but also created a fusion between the XFL system and the NFL's version. So in the USFL, teams can choose to go for an extra point attempt from the 15-yard line, like the NFL, a 2-point attempt from the 2-yard line, NFL and XFL, and a 3-point attempt from the 10-yard line, like the XFL. So this presents coaches with an opportunity to either stick with traditional methods or roll the dice if they feel strong enough about their offensive potential. So that's something to keep in mind about what the USFL is doing. And this is all on usflnewshub.com. For the instant replay, the XFL eliminated coaches' challenges, instead implemented a replay system where replay officials could review questionable rulings and legislate the game. Obvious errors in regards to player safety would be subject to review in the last 5 minutes of the fourth quarter, or during overtime, officials were permitted to correct egregious errors that significantly impacted the outcome of the match. Remember the Seattle game where he didn't kneel and he should have kneeled and they called the game off. That was kind of but the XFL apologized and we moved on. So the USFL will run all of its replays out of its command center in Los Angeles, where all decisions will be made by one replay crew. I would assume it would be Mike Pereira, but he'd probably leave that to somebody else. Coaches will be granted one challenge to use. The command center will have the authority to overrule any incorrect personal foul calls and determine the accuracy of pass interference calls, something that is kind of definitely annoying when it comes into the NFL. The system is more comparable to the NFL's replay structure than the XFL's. The kickoff part, this was kind of, I was reading this and I was like, is this is like the XFLs, or it's not like I don't know. So the kickoffs are arguably the most unique aspect of the XFL rule set. And I believe that the NFL will be doing the XFL kickoff, not this year, maybe in 2025. If the XFL, plays in 2023, they test it around, then maybe they try it in preseason in 2024 to implement in 2025. It will take a while for this, but I have a big suspicion that the NFL will be using the XFL's kickoff by 2025, if everything goes according to plan. So the complexity of the XFL kickoffs requires details to be laid out in their entirety. So here's an excerpt from the XFL's website. Kicker kicks from the 30-yard line. Ball must be in the air and in play between the opponent's 20-yard line and the end zone. Coverage teams line up and return on the 35-yard line. Out-of-bounds kicks, blah, blah, blah. Players can move when the ball is touched by the returner or 3 seconds after the ball touches the ground. If the ball is kicked to the end zone or it's down, it has a major touchback and the ball is placed at the 35-yard line. They don't want touchbacks. If the ball bounces inbounds and then out of the end zone and is down in the end zone, the ball is placed at the 15. The player can, on the return team, touches the ball and it goes out of bounds, blah, blah, blah. The USFL kickoff is nowhere near as complex and instead goes for the NFL's model, but moving the kickoff to the 25-yard line of the kicking team. This was presumably created to prevent kickers from booting the ball into the end zone for a touchback. The receiving team must have a minimum of 8 players in the zone between their 35 and 45-yard line. After the ball travels 20 yards through the air, only the receiving team may touch the ball. So that kind of gives you an idea. It's not like the XFL ones, but it is definitely modified. Now, the XFL made adjustments in the final 2 minutes in each half of the games during the time plays that end, and the field of play resulted in the game clock being stopped until the ball was spotted and 5 seconds had run off the clock. Remember, the XFL had a ball spotter, and their job was to just spot the ball. And that was their job. Pick up the ball, put the ball where it's supposed to be. That was their only job, something that the NFL doesn't do. Incomplete passes and out-of-bound plays meant the game clock was stopped completely until the ball was snapped. In the USFL, the clock will only stop on first downs inside the last 2 minutes of each half. Each league is attempting to make the final moments of both halves more compelling, with extra opportunities being granted on both granted to the offenses. And this is something that the CFL, the CFL is and I'm going to get all into that next when we start bringing back CFL Week in Review. But the CFL, talking about switching 3 downs, there's many tweaks that you can do in the game of play before you go into something as drastic as going from 3 downs to 4 downs, which they shouldn't do in the CFL. The XFL modeled its onside kick after the NFL format by doing a traditional attempt from the team's own 35-yard line like the NFL. The balls also had to travel at least 10 yards before being recovered. Onside kicks had to be announced beforehand to the officials, so surprise onsides were not an option. The USFL has decided to create a more dynamic options by granting squads 2 distinct choices. Teams may either kick from their own 25-yard line in a traditional attempt or elect for a 4th and 12 play from their own 33-yard line. This is an option borrowed from the AAF rulebook and allows for the choice of either a special teams or offensive conversion. I bet you they're going to go offensive conversion. This is something that the XFL did not have at all. And finally, we got a couple more overtime rules. This is where a direct line can be drawn between the XFL and the USFL in regards to the rules usage. The overtime system in the XFL was a shootout format, which we really wanted to see, which I think would have been awesome, where each team had 5 chances to convert as many 2-point plays as possible. In the event that both teams were tied after 5 attempts, they would go to sudden death conversion process. This is the same system in the USFL, but this time with just 3 chances. Another nod given to our man Sam Schwartzstein. It's a vision from the XFL. So they're going from 5 attempts to 3 in the USFL. Punts, something a lot of things the XFL was playing around with. And the XFL gunners had to line up at the line of scrimmage and were not permitted to move laterally until the ball was kicked. The XFL rules mostly discouraged teams from punting on a certain part of the field. If the ball was punted out of bounds inside the 35-yard line, it went to the opponent's end zone or out of the end zone. It would be awarded to the receiving team at the 35-yard line. The USFL, meanwhile, makes a slight tweak by restricting gunners from lining up outside of the numbers or being double-teamed until the ball is kicked. So a slightly different thing, but nobody is adopting the CFL halo rule when it comes to punts. I remember the XFL talking about, specifically Sam Schwartzstein talking about how they tried that rule in the Spring League. And remember, the Spring League people, Brian Woods and Moose Johnson, X was part of the XFL. These guys were around during that time period, and they tried to get the players to do the halo rule. And I remember them saying that they just could not get the players to do that, even though when they go to the CFL, they can do that. But I guess that's because they're seeing other players do it, and they just couldn't. In the U.S., they couldn't get that rule going. And the CFL has a much better special teams interest than the NFL does, that's for sure. Penalties, the most significant penalty applications in the XFL had already been mentioned with the kickoffs and punts. The USFL's primary penalty alter comes with pass interference. Defensive pass interference can still be at the spot of the foul, but only up to 15 yards. This is more reminiscent of the NCAA's DPI rule. Conversely, offensive pass interference and illegal man downfield cannot be assessed if a pass does not cross the line of scrimmage. This is meant to cut down on punishments for the offense unrelated to what has occurred during the play. We've heard Mike Pereira talk about this penalty in particular. Forward, double forward pass, something that was kind of happened, didn't happen in the XFL. Not to sound like a broke rib, but once again, the USFL has adopted an innovation from the XFL. The ability for offense to attempt two forward passes behind the line of scrimmage was a hallmark of the XFL attempt to differentiate itself from other leagues. Apparently, the USFL agreed with that, and they're doing that as well. So clearly, the USFL is attempting to balance the innovation of the XFL bold rule books with the NFL's tried and true traditions. The execution of the rule book will be in full display April 16th in Birmingham. So we will get to see all these plays play out. Also, be on the lookout because you know who else is watching. The XFL will be watching these games and seeing how these rules play out.